Hello everyone. I welcome you all to the 16th lecture of the course Experimental Methods in Thermal Engineering. In the last lecture, we had started our discussion on measurement of pressure, and we have discussed some of the mechanical pressure measurement techniques where by just noting down the change in level of the liquid, we are actually trying to find out the pressure. Okay. And we also tried to see the response of the pressure measurement device, particularly from the fluidic point of view. Okay. And we have also tried to see that if we are having the dynamic response, then we have to consider rise time and phase lag as the two important parameters while selecting a measurement uh, device for or transducer for measurement of our pressure in physical phenomenon. Okay. Now we will continue our discussion on other different devices which are used for measurement of pressure. So one such device is known as Bourdon tube pressure gauge, and it is actually very popular also. Majority of the times if you go to any industrial system, or even you see in the laboratory setups also, where we are having the static or steady value of the pressure and our pressure is not dynamically changing. Under all such scenarios, majority of the time you will be finding that these type of gauges are actually being used. Okay, so mainly these gauges are based on the uh, principle where we are having of sensing elements, and particularly these mechanical deformations are taking place in the elastic limit of the material. Okay, so by meaning of elastic limit means when we will be applying certain amount of pressure, or when fluid will be applying certain amount of pressure on the sensing element of the transducer, particularly these transducer will be having certain deformation, and once that pressure is released, the transducer will be coming back to its original position. Okay, so that type of principle is something which is known as the deformation under the elastic conditions. Okay, and if the deformation remains permanent and it do not regain its original shape, then generally we call the deformations as plastic deformations. Okay, now before going to the explanation of Bourdon tube pressure gauge, let us first try to see the historic point from where actually it has started. Okay, so there was a French engineer E. Bourdon who was actually involved in manufacturing of a steam engine. Okay, so what happened, particularly for condensing the steam, they were actually fabricating some helical coil copper tubes. Okay, so particularly 1849, what he observed that while they have converted a straight tube of copper into a helical tube or helical coil, during this transformation from straight to helical structure, what they have seen, there is actually deformation in the cross section of the tube, and the cross section of the tube has actually flattened. So instead of circular, it has become some oval or elliptical type cross section. Okay, so what they have done, because they want to do or they want to consider for increasing for having the heat transfer characteristics, they want to have almost circular cross section of that spiral tube. Okay, so what they have done, they have actually closed one end of this coil, and to the other end of the coil they have supplied some pressure. Okay, so while the pressure has been supplied, it is observed that this flattened cross section has actually tried to convert or tried to move towards the circular shape. Okay, and while this shape of the cross section has changed, there had been elongation of this coil structure. Okay, so it means these coils were having initially say certain P amount of pitch. So while they have applied this pressure, cross section has also changed, and at the same point of time, whatever the spacing was there between the two consecutive coil structures, that spacing has also actually increased and coil has elongated. Okay, so that was the actually idea. So particularly while workers were doing this type of fabrication process, E. Borden, who was an engineer over there, he actually observed this process. Okay, and based on that, he has started experimentation and he has actually developed some gauge for measurement of the pressure. And from there itself, that particular gauge is known as Borden type pressure gauge, and the tube which we are using over here, that particular tube structure is known as actually Borden tube. Okay. So what initially he has done, instead of taking a helical structure, initially he has taken actually a C type tube. Okay, so this tube structure was something like this. So he has initially taken a C type tube. So what has been done, this end of the tube, particularly one end of the tube has been fixed. So you can see over here, this particular end of the tube is fixed over here, and this is our C type tube, and other end of the tube was actually closed. So at that point, this end is closed. However, it is not fitted to the main body. It is having flexibility to move in particularly in this radial direction. So it can move like this or like this. Okay. So what has been done, because this particular end was closed, then whatever the pressure we want to measure, that pressure actually was supplied from the fixed end. Okay, and while this pressure has increased inside the tube above then the atmospheric pressure condition, it has been found that if you see initially in the neutral condition, this was the tube axis. So it was found that actually tube has moved in radial outward direction. Okay, and while this tube is actually moving in radial outward direction, basically what is happening, because of the pressure, this tube is moving like this, and this tube is actually trying to straighten up. Okay, so that was the main idea, that while the pressure is applied, what tube is doing, tube is actually trying to straighten up. So why tube is trying to straighten up? So what he has done initially, why he selected this C type tube, if at any point I take a section plane, say this is my section plane AA, so particularly you will be finding at this plane AA, the cross section of the tube is something like this. Okay, so it's not a circular cross section, rather the initially whatever the cross section was taken, that was either oval, or I can call it as nothing but a elliptic cross section. Okay, so here you can see that this tube is having certain thickness also, and the cross section of the tube is elliptic. Okay, so there are a number of phenomenon which will be happening, particularly the mechanical phenomenon which will be happening during the elastic deformation of the tube. So what will be happening when we are supplying certain amount of pressure? So obviously that pressure will be acting on the walls of the tube. So over here also it will be acting, and so you can see that the nature of the pressure force, whatever because of the fluid is acting on the surface of the tube, that you can see is nothing but a tensile, because it will try to move the boundaries of the tube in outward direction. Okay, so we can see that because of the fluid pressure, there is formation of nothing but tensile stresses inside our tube cross section. Okay, then another type of phenomenon which will be happening, now when the pressure will be supplied, the cross section of the tube will try to change its shape from oval or elliptic cross section towards the circular cross section. Okay, so while this cross section will be changing from oval shape to circular shape, during that time what will be happening, the outer surface of the tube will be subjected to nothing but tensile stresses, and inside surface of the tube will be subjected to compressive stresses. Okay, so that is another stress formation inside the tube material, and these stresses are basically outside tensile and inside compressive are generating because of the change in cross section of the tube. Okay, then third, another type of stress will be forming. So you can see over here, while this tube is actually moving in outward direction, during that process what is happening, basically the entire length of the tube is actually trying to straighten up. Okay, so we can see that while this tube is moving in outward direction, it means the tube is trying to straighten up. If tube is trying to straighten up, then whatever the material we are having for the outer wall, that will be actually compressing, and whatever the material we are having for the inner wall, that material will be actually expanding. Okay, so because if you are having some curvature profile, if that curvature is trying to become a straight line, in that case what will be happening, outer wall of that curved periphery will be actually having some sort of compression, and inner tube will be actually, inner portion will be elongating. Okay, so because of this effect, that our tube is actually trying to straighten up, because of that effect, what will be happening, on the inner wall there will be formation of tensile stresses, and on outer wall there will be the formation of compressive stresses. Okay, so you can clearly see that the pressure is having effect of tensile nature only. Okay, and change of cross section is having effect of tensile on outer periphery and compressive on inner periphery. Whereas the straightening up of the tube has effect of compressive stresses on outer periphery and tensile stresses on the inner periphery. Okay, so what will be happening? This type of unbalance of stresses, what it will be doing at a given value of pressure, it will lead to the elastic deformation of the tube unless or until a new equilibrium point is established. Okay, so that is what will be happening over here. Particularly because of the elongation, whatever tensile stress we are having, that tensile stress will be actually balanced by the compressive stress which will be generating because of the change of the cross section. Okay, likewise it will be happening on the outer periphery of this tube. Okay, so this balance of the stresses at any pressure state leads to the new equilibrium position for the tube. Okay, so that's why what happens, depending upon the value of the pressure inside the tube, there will be actually deformation of the tube, and that mode of deformation or amount of deformation actually will be having some dependence, linear dependence with our pressure. Okay, now what is basically done, mechanism is developed which will be actually finding out that how much tip travel we are having, and that tip travel it will be converting into the motion of the needle, and that particular needle is having some scale over here which is calibrated, and that gives us the value of the pressure. Okay, so particularly this outward motion of the tip of the Bourdon tube is something which is known as tip travel. Okay, so this outward motion is known as tip travel. So for a given tip travel, what we are having some mechanism over here, and that mechanism will be giving nothing but angular motion of the needle. Okay, and once our pressure is released, tube will be coming back to the original position because of the elastic nature of the deformation. Okay, and particularly over this mechanism what we are having, because when we will be using a pressure gauge for longer duration, obviously because of the development of some residual stresses, what it will be happening, there will be some lag in between our obtained pressure value and the deformation of that loop. So because of that, there will be development of some inaccuracies. Okay, so what is being done after a fixed duration, this particular type of gauges are once again recalibrated, and while these are recalibrated, particularly over this mechanism, we are having some adjustment screw in order to uh, adjust the scale of the gauge as reference to the corresponding material condition of the gauge at that particular instant. Okay, now one typical example is shown over here. So this is, you can see we are having one metallic tube, and here we are having a very small capillary, and through this capillary actually flow of fluid will be happening inside, and then particularly this portion shows where our Bourdon tube is actually welded to this particular section over here, and then this is our structure of the Bourdon tube, and you can clearly see that the cross section of the Bourdon tube is nothing but elliptical. Okay, and this is the tip of the Bourdon tube, which will be then further connected to the mechanism which will be showing us the reading over the scale. Okay, so this particular type of Bourdon tube type gauge is something which is known as a C type gauge, because here you can see the shape of the Bourdon tube is actually identical to that of alphabet C. So that's why it is actually called as C type gauge also. Okay. Then Bourdon tube gauges also comes in different types. So one type already I have specified to you. This is known as C type. Then another type is actually helical Bourdon gauge. So in case of helical Bourdon gauge, what we will be having? We will be having helix type structure. So whatever I have shown you, and in this helix type structure, one end of the helix will be fixed, and inside that helical tube, pressure will be supplied, and other end will be actually connected to the scale. So now, depending upon the value of pressure, there will be a linear displacement in the helix, and that linear displacement is actually linked to the gradual variation of the scale in order to find out the value of the pressure. Okay. Then another type of arrangement we are having. So in this particular type of arrangement, the tube is actually made of spiral structure. Okay. So this tube is actually spiral structure, and over that spiral tube, we are having some scale also. So depending upon the value of the pressure, there will be coiling and uncoiling of this spiral tube. Okay, so these are different commercially available types of the Bourdon type pressure gauges. Then when we design this Bourdon tube pressure gauges, there are some important design factors. So one of the important factor is the material of the element of which our tube is actually made up of. Another important factor is length of the coil. Next important factor is thickness of the wall, and cross-sectional shape. What should be the initial shape of the cross-section when we are actually fabricating the gauge, and then desired tip travel, how much our tip should move, okay, in order to reflect certain value of the pressure. So brass, phosphor, bronze, and beryllium copper are the main materials which are used for particularly grade B type accuracy gauges. So the by meaning of grade B means we require certain gauges which are being employed at industrial measurements, and there we want to only have a rough estimate of the pressure. So these are not very accurate. Obviously, they are the accurate pressure gauges, but their precision will not be very good. Okay. Then, apart from that, for certain applications where we require the more accuracy, more precision, for such applications, we are having the higher quality grade A and grade A gauges, and sometimes for high pressure gauges also we go for the non-ferrous metal as the materials of which our tube will be made up of. Okay. Then this C type of pressure gauges are having limit up to the 60 bar pressures. And when we are using the gauges for low pressure applications, then flatter cross sections are preferred with thin walls. Why? Because if we will be having thin walls, there will be, and more flatter cross section, there will be more deformation of the tube. So it means our device will be sensitive to the smaller variations or smaller fluctuations in the pressure. Okay. And if we are using for high pressure applications, then obviously what we want that the large amount of pressure should result in some deformation, because if we are having the large amount of pressure and in significant amount of deformation, then it may go into the plastic deformation limit. So we want to keep the deformation within the elastic limit, so that once the pressure is removed, our gauge should actually, or our tube should actually regain its original position, okay, or original shape. So that's why when we go for the high pressure applications, in order to limit the deformation within the elastic limit, we go for rounder cross sections and we go for the thicker walls. Okay, so in that case, what will be happening when we are having the significant variation in the pressure, then only we will be able to find out the deformation. So particularly for this type of high pressure gauges, what we will be having, there will be less sensitivity, and for low pressure measurements, whatever the gauge we will be using, that will be having the high sensitivity of the measurement. Okay. And obviously, if we are having some hot fluid, so while that hot fluid will be interacting with the surface of the tube, or if we consider our surrounding conditions are also having some temperature, different temperature conditions. Then depending upon that, because there will be some thermal expansion and contraction of the tube material involved, so because of that there may be some errors associated in our pressure measurements. So particularly when our temperature effects are also becoming important, then this nickel span C type alloys are actually mainly employed, okay, which are less sensitive to the temperature fluctuations. Okay, so this is all about Bourdon tube type gauges, and particularly the Bourdon tube type gauges are used for the static pressure measurements only. And we are having some dial gauge where we can read the value of the pressure. Okay. Then another type of gauges which are very important. So these are the diaphragm type gauges. So these may be employed for static as well as for the dynamic pressure measurement applications. Okay. So construction wise, if you see, we will be having some structure. Inside that structure there will be some diaphragm which will be fixed. Okay, so this is nothing but my front view. If I draw the top view, its cross section is nothing but a circular, so it means our diaphragm is nothing but a small thin disc. Okay, so this is a thin disc like structure which is fitted, or particularly its outer edge is fitted over some specific geometry. Okay, that is also geometry is also nothing but of circular nature. Then across the two ends of the diaphragm we will be having some different pressure conditions. So depending upon the difference of the pressure or loading of the pressure, what will be happening, there will be deflection of the diaphragm. Okay, so you can see the corresponding deflection profile over here. So in this particular condition, what we are considering that outer edge of the diaphragm is nothing but fixed. Okay, so across the outer circumference of the diaphragm disc, that is actually fixed to the wall, and then over the entire diaphragm cross section, what we are having nothing but uniformly distributed pressure. Okay, so if you can see, the profile of the pressure is actually uniformly distributed over the entire cross sectional area of the diaphragm. Okay, and A is the radius of the diaphragm, and R is actually the radial distance when measured corresponding to the center of the diaphragm. Okay, so particularly for this type of diaphragm, what we will be having, our maximum deflection at the center will be given by this formula 3p divided by 1680 cube into a to power 4 1 minus mu square. So over here E is nothing but modulus of elasticity of the diaphragm material, T is thickness of the diaphragm, and mu is Poisson's ratio. So Poisson's ratio is nothing but minus of lateral strain divided by the longitudinal strain. Okay, and if you have to determine the deformation at any particular radial location R, so that can be obtained using this particular formulation. Okay, then once again we are having so same diaphragm type. Outer edge of the diaphragm is also fixed, and inner portion at the center is also fixed. So you can see if this is my cross section of the diaphragm, its outer edge is fixed, and at the same point of time some portion of the inner portion is also actually fixed. So you can see over here the portion which is fixed about the center is having radius B. Okay, and whatever the remaining portion of the diaphragm is there, which can actually deflect depending upon the value of the pressure, that is actually subjected to the uniform value of the pressure. Okay, so for particular this type of arrangement, when we are having a portion of diaphragm fixed from both inner and outer sides, for that you can find out the value of maximum deflection using this particular formula. Okay, then another situation we may have, which is nothing but physically identical to that of the case 2. The only difference is that now instead of having a uniformly distributed pressure, we are having some localized pressure which is acting close to the inner hinged surface of the diaphragm. So this is the inner hinged surface, and close to that only some localized pressure is actually acting. Okay, so in this particular type of situation, we will be having the maximum deflection of the diaphragm, which can be obtained from this particular relation. Okay, so now, as I have told you that what is happening over here in this particular type of device, the change or the differential pressure which is acting across the two ends of the diaphragm, these are leading to its deflection. So we require certain device which can find out or which can give us the value of the deflection. And obviously, because all these deformations are taking place in the elastic limit, so amount of deformation will be very, very small, so it will be very difficult to measure it. And moreover, because it can be employed for measurement of the dynamic pressure, so that's why we may have to dynamically note down the value of the deformation. Okay, so in order to facilitate the dynamic measurement of the deformation of the diaphragm, what is basically done, a device is fitted over this diaphragm, and that particular device is something which is known as strain gauge. Okay, now strain gauge particularly, mainly whatever the type of the strain gauge we use in our pressure transducer, so mainly resistance type strain gauges are employed for measuring the deformation. Okay, so this is one representation which is shown over here, that your strain gauge is actually fitted over the diaphragm. So when there will be certain deformation of the diaphragm, obviously there will be formation of some localized strain, and whatever the localized strain is coming, that can be measured using a resistance type strain gauge. So how it can be measured, that we will try to see in the further slides. Okay, but before that, one more thing just I would like to highlight over here. So particularly over here in these first two figures, if you see, you can see that the surface of the diaphragm is nothing but smooth. So this type of diaphragm will be having sensitivity towards the low pressure measurements. And if we have to go for the high pressure measurements, obviously their deformations will be going to the beyond the elastic limits. So what we have to do in order to make it operatable at the high pressure conditions, what we do, instead of taking flat surface diaphragm, normally corrugated diaphragms are taken. Okay, so this type of corrugated diaphragm helps us in decreasing the amount of deformation which is happening inside the structure. So because of that, what will be happening? It requires actually large values of the pressure in order to generate the sufficient deformation which can be measured and can reflect the value. So this type of corrugated diaphragm can be employed for the measurement of the high pressure. Okay, and flat type diaphragm are applicable for the low pressure applications. Then identical to diaphragm, we may have one more type of gauge, that is something known as the bellow type gauge. So in case of bellow type gauge, as I have already told you, bellow type devices are also used for the density measurement. So we will be having some bellow type structure, and how a bellow type structure looks, actually I have shown one this photograph also, and this is the schematic representation. So depending upon the value of pressure inside the bellow and outside the bellow, we will be having its actually deformation and contraction in the axial direction. And if we measure that displacement of the bellow, that will be actually leading to the value of the pressure difference across its two ends. Okay. Another type of arrangement can be employed when we are having a diaphragm, and inside the diaphragm also we are having some pressure, and outside the diaphragm we are also having another pressure. So this type of diaphragm is particularly used for measurement of the differential pressure, and in this particular diaphragm we are having some inductive tip over here, and in this tip, across the periphery of this tip, we are having some primary coil through which we have given certain voltage. Now depending upon the location of this tip over here, there will be some output voltage which will be obtained from these secondary coils, and for different conditions of the pressure, there will be different displacement of the diaphragm. Corresponding to that, we can note down the values of the output voltage, and corresponding to that, we can actually calibrate our pressure measurement device. Okay, so over here what is done, while this diaphragm will be actually oscillating under the dynamic conditions of the pressure, the frequency of diaphragm oscillations is given, which is nothing but 10.21 divided by a square. So where a is nothing but once again refers to the radius of this diaphragm. So E is elastic modulus, P is thickness, mu is Poisson's ratio, and rho is the density of the material of the diaphragm. Okay, so this frequency is given in hertz. So if you substitute all these values, particularly for the brass material, so you will be finding the final formulation of the frequency using this formula. Okay, so this is after we are substituting the values of Poisson's ratio elastic modulus within the elastic limits. Okay. Now, what I have told you just now that in particular, while we are measuring the pressure, what we will be doing, uh, particularly using the diaphragm type pressure transducers, we will be having some deformations of the diaphragm, and that deformation of the diaphragm we will be measuring using nothing but our strain gauge. Okay, and I have already told you that normally in practical scenarios, resistance type strain gauges are mainly employed. Okay, so what will be happening, it means that when we will be having certain deformation within our diaphragm, corresponding to that there will be some strain, and that strain value will be actually basically reflected over our strain gauge in terms of the change in resistance of the strain gauge. So that's why what we are calling the type of the strain gauge as nothing but resistance type strain gauge. So now let us try to see the relationship in between the resistance and the value of the strain whatever we are obtaining. Okay. So we know from our fundamental physics that resistance is nothing but equal to rho into L times A, where rho is actually resistivity of the material, L refers to the length of the wire, and A is area of cross section of the resistance wire. Okay, whatever has been used to fabricate the strain gauge. Now let us take the differential of this equation. So if I take differential, I can write dr as nothing but equal to d rho into L by A plus dl into rho by A, and minus rho into L, and why I am taking minus, because differential of 1 by A will be nothing but minus 1 by A square into dA. Okay. Now, if I divide this differential equation by R, so on left hand side I can write dr by R, and on the right hand side I'll be actually substituting the value of R. So if I substitute the value of R, I'll be finding d rho by rho uh, dA divided by A. Okay. Now what we can do, if we know that capital D is the diameter of the wire, in that case I can simply write my area as nothing but pi into D square divided by 4. So that will be my area. Now if I find out the value of dA by A using this formulation of diameter, my dA divided by A will become nothing but 2 times of dD divided by D. Okay. So now if I substitute this value over here, I'll be finally finding that my dr divided by R is equal to d rho by rho plus dl divided by L minus 2 times D into D divided by capital D. Okay. So over here, this dl by L is nothing but change in length divided by original length. So this represents nothing but our axial strain. Okay. So dA by A is nothing but it represents our axial strain. Okay. Then what we are having after that? After that, we know that our Poisson's ratio is nothing but minus of lateral strain divided by axial strain. Okay, where our lateral strain is nothing but equal to dD divided by D, and axial strain is nothing but dL by L. And that I have written minus dD by D divided by this dl by L, I can simply write as epsilon A. Okay. So now if I substitute this formulation over here, finally I'll be getting my dr divided by R is nothing but equal to d rho divided by rho plus epsilon A. Okay. And instead of dd by D, I can write epsilon time mu with minus sign. So it will be becoming nothing but plus 2 times of epsilon A. Okay. And finally, I can write from here that my change in resistance divided by original resistance is nothing but equal to change in resistivity plus over here there will be one mu also. So 1 plus 2 mu times epsilon A. Okay, so this is the relationship you can see over here in between the axial strain and the change in resistance of the wire which is used to fabricate a strain gauge. Okay, now we define one important factor over here which is known as a strain gauge factor. So now here comes a factor which is known as strain gauge factor F, and that factor F is nothing but equal to dr divided by r divided by epsilon A. So from here you can see that our strain gauge factor F is nothing but equal to dr by r. I can substitute as 1 by epsilon A into d rho by rho plus 1 plus 2 times mu. Okay, so that is our factor. This factor F is something which is known as a strain gauge factor. Okay, and particularly if you see from the definition, our strain gauge change in resistance of the wire delta R divided by original resistance is nothing but equal to F times of epsilon A. Okay, so that is the main measure. So what we do when we take a particular type of strain gauge, so basically what is done, a manufacturer actually uh, specifies the strain factor for that particular type of gauge, and that strain factor is actually used to relate the change in resistance of the strain gauge with reference to the axial value of the strain which is obtained from a device. Okay. Now, particularly, you can see over here, if I consider that for any particular wire material, if my resistivity of that material is independent of the strain, so it means rho is not at all depending upon value of the strain which is produced inside the wire. In that case, what will be happening? Our value of the strain factor will be becoming nothing but equal to 1 plus 2 mu. Okay. So now if I take that within the elastic limit, if I go beyond the value of 0.5, 0.4, zero point 0.5 or beyond zero point 0.5, the value of Poisson ratio, in that case, we will be actually going to the plastic limit. So obviously, in order to limit ourselves within the elastic limit, we generally try to keep the value of Poisson's ratio within 0.3. So corresponding to 0.3 Poisson's ratio, if I calculate the value of F, I'll be finding nothing but equal to 1.6. Okay. So one important conclusion you can make over here from this value of F, that when we are considering that our resistivity is not changing with the strain produced in the wire, in that case we are getting the value of F factor as equal to 1.6, and it's a constant parameter. Okay, and if we consider that value of resistivity actually decreases upon increase of the strain within the wire. So in that case, what will be happening in our formulation of in the formulation of F, we are having over here 1 by epsilon A, and I am saying that when our strain is increasing, value of this resistivity is actually decreasing. So this ratio will be negative because d rho will be negative. So it means our value of F will be nothing but less than 1.6. And if our resistivity of the material is increasing with increase in axial strain, in that case value of F will be actually greater than 1.6. Okay. Now for typical range of materials which are used for measuring the or which are used for obtaining the resistance type strain gauges, the value of factor F varies from minus 140 to plus 175. Okay, so this is the typical range of the strain gauge factor which is used in practical applications. Okay, apart from that, one important point I would like to highlight over here. So you have come to know, particularly from this relation, that our delta R means change in resistance is nothing but equal to R F into epsilon A. Okay, so it means that our change in resistance is nothing but directly proportional to the value of strain factor F. So if our value of F is large, in that case, what will be happening? For the same amount of the strain, we will be having large change of the resistance. Okay, so depending upon the sensitivity of the strain gauge we are using for what application, based on that actually we select the value, or we select our material of the strain gauge wire in order to get the desired value of the strain factor. Okay, now if you see, we are having the different types of electric resistance type strain gauges available. So particularly the very first photograph which is shown over here, you can see you are having some two terminals, okay, and then we are having some wire type structure over here. So this particular type of strain gauge is known as wire type strain gauge. Then another structure is here where we are having a very thin filament, and that thin filament is actually considered as the device for measurement of the strain. So this type of strain gauge is known as foil type strain gauge. Then we are having another type of strain gauge which is known as semiconductor resistance element type strain gauge. So here you are having some semiconductor material. So particularly many times silicon is used as a semiconductor material over here, and uh, one of the these characteristics of these semiconductor strain gauges is that they are having the high value of factor F. Okay, so now let us try to see over here the different materials which can be employed for fabrication of the strain gauges. So these are the different names of the materials. Then these are the approximate values of the F. So you can see particularly for silicon semiconductor type strain gauges, the value of F factor may vary from -100 to +150. Okay, and for certain compositions of the material, we are having the fixed value of the strain gauge factor F. Okay, and then corresponding to that, the approximate resistivity is also given over here, and we are having some temperature coefficient also, because what will be happening while we will be having the change in temperature of the wire. So that change in temperature of the wire can also lead to its expansion. Okay, so for that we are having some temperature coefficient factor, because that temperature can also lead to some change in resistance of the material. Okay, and these are remarks corresponding to each type of the material. So you can see different temperature conditions are given under which these devices can be employed, and particularly the silicon type semiconductor devices are brittle, but these are having the high gauge factor. So it means these are not suitable for large strain measurements, because when we will be having the large strain, then this type of brittle, there will be chances that these brittle devices will be actually fracturing, and these will be going into the plastic deformation region. So that's why when we are using the semiconductor type devices, these are required when we have to go for the high sensitivity. Means we have to go for large change of resistance value for the small change in the strain. Okay, so these are the different applications for different materials which are commercially available for measuring the strain. Okay, then there are certain guidelines for using the strain gauges. What basically we do while we measure the strain. So for example, this is our diaphragm surface. So what we will be doing, we will be pasting a strain gauge over the diaphragm surface. So this is our diaphragm, and this particular device which we have pasted exactly over the surface, that I am calling as nothing my strain gauge. Okay, so why it should be rigidly pasted? Because whatever the deformation is happening in our diaphragm, the same amount of deformation should happen in our strain gauge. Because if there is the difference of deformation between the two, there will be some errors which will be associated with our measurement. Okay, so for that particularly, what is done, the surface of the uh, device where we want to put our strain gauge, that should be actually absolutely clean. Okay, and then what we do, we use some adhesive in between our strain gauge and the surface where we want to apply or where we want to put it, so that we should allow sufficient time for the adhesive or cement to dry and harden completely. Okay, so different type of cements are used. So nitrocellulose cement, then phenolic resin are used particularly as the bonding agent. So what is basically done? So if we are having say a wire type strain gauge, so we take that wire type strain gauge. First, that wire is actually fitted on a paper. So why it is fitted on a backing paper? So that while we are pasting it on the surface, there should not be any changes in the configuration of the wire. Okay, and then that particular wire is actually on the other end subjected to this resin, and then it is fitted all over the surface. So particularly when we are using nitrocellulose cement and phenolic resins, then we can employ the strain gauge up to the temperature limit of 150 degrees Celsius. And if instead of paper we are going for the bakelite mounting, in that case actually we can go up to the temperatures of 260 degrees Celsius. Okay. Then there are a few problems which are associated with the strain gauges while we are taking the measurements. So one of the problem is because of the temperature effect. So when the temperature will be changing, because of the temperature, there may be expansion and contraction of the wire material, which will be leading to the change in resistance. So because of that, also we may have some errors. Okay, another cause of error is actually moisture content. So for example, if somehow moisture is actually getting into our wires, so what happens that inclusion of the moisture actually can change the resistance behavior of the wire. So apart from the elongation due to the strain, there may be the changes in the resistance because of the addition of the moisture also. So that will be also giving the wrong errors. Okay, and another error may be because of the poor wirings or poor wire connections. So if we are not doing the wire connections properly, then also we may find some wrong values of the resistance. Okay. Okay, so this is like all about the use of the strain gauges, but till this point we have only understood the concept that strain gauge is a device which will be actually converting the deformation signal, or in other words I should say the strain which will be on the diaphragm, that strain it will be nothing but converting it into the resistance signal. Okay, but once we have some change in resistance, now we require certain electrical circuitry or electrical arrangement which will be actually assisting us in obtaining the value of that particular resistance. Okay, so generally the circuit which is used for obtaining the value of the resistance, unknown resistance, because what we are doing initially when we have fitted the strain gauge, at that point obviously the manufacturer supplies two values. So one is the resistance of the strain gauge and another is strain gauge factor. Okay, but whatever the change in resistance will be happening in the practical scenario, so we require some arrangement to measure that change in resistance. Okay, so for that, what we do normally, you might have studied in your basic electrical engineering courses that we are having some electrical circuit which is known as Wheatstone bridge. Okay, and this particular Wheatstone bridge is actually used for measurement of the unknown resistances. Okay, so what we are having over here, I have given illustration of a Wheatstone bridge where we are having four terminal points A, B, C, and D, and then we are having the four resistance values. So one is R2 and R3. So these R2 and R3 nothing but these two are the known resistance values. Then we are having one Rx resistance over here, which is nothing but our unknown resistance. So particularly you can consider this as nothing but your strain gauge. Okay. Then we are having some R1 resistance over here. So initially R1 is also unknown, and what we do, R1 is nothing but a variable resistance. So we vary the value of this resistance in order to balance our Wheatstone bridge. So this terminal A and C of this bridge, these are subjected to some potential voltage E, and then we are having this switch S1 in order to complete this circuit. Okay. Then across the other two terminals B and D, we connect a device, galvanometer over here. And what we do, we try to see the deflection of this galvanometer. Okay. So basically, what we try to do, this galvanometer, if you try to see over here, it is nothing but connected in between point B and point D. Okay. So if we have to find out the what is the reading that is being reflected on this galvanometer, that will be nothing but equal to, if we are measuring the voltage, that will be nothing but the difference of voltage at point B and at point D. Okay, so these are our 2 points. Now you can clearly see over here that what we are doing, we are subjecting this entire circuit to some voltage E. So because of that voltage E, what we will be happening across each of the register, we will be having certain drop of the voltage. Okay, and then particularly when we are having the bridge in the balanced condition, then obviously corresponding to that the voltage reflected over here will be zero. But before that, if bridge is in unbalanced situation, then obviously this galvanometer will also be giving us the certain value of the voltage. Okay, so what initially we can do, initially first, if we start that with the condition that our bridge is actually in unbalanced situation. Okay, so if bridge is in unbalanced situation, I can determine the value of voltage corresponding to point number B, and corresponding to point number B, my voltage will be nothing but equal to E times R3 divided by R2 plus R3. Okay. Similarly, if I have to determine the voltage corresponding to point D, so corresponding to point D, my voltage will be nothing but E times Rx divided by R1 plus Rx. Okay, so this is coming from the knowledge of our basic electrical engineering. Here we are nothing but we are doing the voltage division. Okay, so then in that case, what will be happening? Whatever the value of voltage we will be obtaining, say galvanometric voltage over here, that will be nothing but equal to voltage of point B minus voltage of point D. Okay. So from here, you can see clearly we will be having E as common, and we will be having R3 divided by R2 plus R3 minus Rx divided by R1 plus Rx. Okay. Then if we consider that our entire bridge is nothing but in balanced situation, in that case we will be equating this VB minus VD equal to 0. So then only if our voltage drop across each of these resistors becomes in the proportion, it becomes same, then we call that Wheatstone bridge is nothing but our balanced. So, or ultimately, in other words, I can say that when corresponding to this galvanometer output, if I get the zero value of the voltage, then also we can say that our bridge circuit is nothing but balanced. Okay. So from here, what I can do, I can simply write my R3 times R1 plus Rx is equal to Rx times R2 plus R3. Okay, so you can see over here R1 R3 plus R3 Rx is becoming equal to Rx R2 plus R3 into Rx. So R3 into Rx, R3 into Rx will be cancelling out, and finally I'll be finding that R1 divided by Rx is nothing but equal to R2 divided by R3. So in order to have the balanced Wheatstone bridge, what we will be having? We will be having the uh, ratio of resistances is nothing but same. So from using this particular formulation, what I can do, if I have to find out the value of the unknown resistance of the strain gauge Rx, I can just simply relate it equal to nothing but R1 into R2 divided by R2. So using this particular formulation, I can find out the value of unknown resistance Rx. Okay. So how normally the operation is performed over here? What we do, so we are having this R1 as nothing but our variable resistance. So when we have connected our unknown resistance, we will be switching on both the switches S1 and S2, And after that, what we will do, we will try to measure the value of voltage across these two terminal points B and D. So obviously, when our circuit is unbalanced, in that case, what will be happening? We will be actually getting some value of voltage over here. Now we will be changing the value of this variable resistance R1 till the point our voltage reflected over here is nothing but equal to 0. Once we are getting over here our value of voltage equal to 0, in that case we can say that our circuit is balanced, and corresponding to that we can just note it down the value of R1, and from there then using this particular formulation we can determine the value of this unknown resistance Rx. Okay, so this is one of the principle which can be employed for measuring the value of unknown resistance of the strain gauge. But one drawback of this particular device is that this type of device is only applicable if we have to go for the static or steady measurements. Okay, and if we are having the dynamic or transient measurements, in that case, what will be happening? We will not be getting sufficient time to adjust this resistance in order to obtain some value of the unknown resistance. Okay, so what basically happens when we are having the situation of unbalanced circuits, situation of dynamic conditions when our signals are actually dynamically changing. So in that case, what we have to do, instead of going for the balanced Wheatstone bridge, we have to go for the unbalanced bridges. Okay, and what I will do now, I will stop at this point, and particularly how unbalanced bridges can be employed for measurement of the unknown resistances that we will try to see in the next lecture.